If you put good diets together with regular physical activity, not smoking, not overdoing alcohol, not being overweight or obese, we could prevent over 90% of type 2 diabetes, over 80% of heart disease. The evidence on eggs is actually a little bit complicated. In general, the studies haven't shown that eggs are related to increased risk of heart disease, except maybe among people with type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes. But that doesn't mean that eggs are the healthiest breakfast, because there's a lot of confusion, a lot of misinformation, disinformation out there, and it is complicated. There is no exact one specific diet that everybody needs to follow. In fact, the good news is there's a lot of flexibility about how we can eat in a healthy way. It happens to fit a traditional Mediterranean diet. There's a huge amount of evidence showing that that's a healthy way to eat. But what we now understand is you can put that combination of foods together with the foods from different cultures, different flavors, and that's what gives tremendous variety. A lot of confusion and uncertainty actually about that direct causal relationship between HDL and low risk of heart disease, but it's definitely low HDL is definitely a high predictor of increased risk of heart disease. Underlying insulin resistance is related to infertility, and of course obesity is the major driver of insulin resistance.
Hey there, welcome to the Happy Habit Podcast. I'm your host, Matthew. As always, I'm here Mondays and Thursdays talking to really interesting people on health, well-being and self-improvement. Now, thank you so much to all the new subscribers. We've had a huge increase in subscribers and interest in recent weeks, which is amazing. So many of you, however, are consuming these episodes without subscribing. All I ask you to do is two things. You can subscribe by clicking that subscribe button. It's absolutely free, and share with other people who you think might enjoy the content in these episodes too. Now, today I'm joined by Harvard Professor Walter Willett. He is the author of Eat, Drink and Be Healthy and is one of the most cited research nutrition scientists ever. I ask him about the importance of diet and its impact on our health. We hear his views on the wide range of diets that are out there today, everything from carnivore to keto to vegan. Learn how fertility is impacted by the foods you eat. I ask, should we be drinking milk and should we be consuming fruit given its high levels of fructose? What are Professor Willett's views on eggs and cholesterol, which has been a contentious topic over the decades? I also challenge Professor Willett's stance on topics such as meat and dietary fat, which some commentators that I've had on this podcast in recent weeks have been at odds with. We cover an awful lot in this conversation, and I really hope that you get some value from it. You might be able to clear up some confusion that seems to be out there at the moment about what the optimal diet for human beings actually is.
Well, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of misinformation, disinformation out there, and it is complicated. There is no exact one specific diet that everybody needs to follow. In fact, the good news is there's a lot of flexibility about how we can eat in a healthy way. And also today, as I think most people understand, at least outside of the U.S., that the environment is really important, and we need to keep an eye on how what we eat affects climate change and other environmental impacts at the same time. But we did look at this issue of what is a healthy diet. In a major international commission we set up to identify a way to feed what will be about 10 billion people by 2050, a diet that is both healthy and sustainable. And after putting all the data together, it came down to something pretty simple. And with some flexibility. Most of our calories will be coming from grains, but it's really important they be whole grains. A good bit of our calories will be coming from fats and oils, and it's important that those mostly be healthy, unsaturated plant oils. Of course, plenty of fruits and vegetables. And for major protein sources, emphasizing plant protein sources over animal protein sources. If you want to be a vegan or a vegetarian, you could, but about what it comes down to is about 2 servings of animal source proteins would be both healthy and sustainable, with one of those being about 1 serving of dairy a day. Looks like yogurt, cheese may be a little bit better way to have the dairy than just straight milk. And then about 1 other animal source of protein per day, with about 2 servings a week being fish, about 2 being poultry, a few eggs during the week, and red meat being not more than about once per week. So that's you can put this together in lots of different ways. It happens to fit a traditional Mediterranean diet quite well. And there's a huge amount of evidence showing that that's a healthy way to eat. But what we now understand is you can put that combination of foods together with the foods from different cultures, different flavors, and that's what gives tremendous variety and opportunities for a lot of enjoyment.
How influential in that case is diet on people's health, and by extension, how harmful is a poor diet on people's metabolic functioning?
We did an analysis looking at that question. 3 different groups looked at this in different ways, and we all came to pretty similar results that somewhere about 20-25% of premature deaths could be avoided. We have a paper coming out next week that looks at this in more detail. That percentage may be a little bit higher in our more recent analysis, and we see lower risks of all major causes of death. Cardiovascular disease, cancer, neurodegenerative disease, pulmonary disease, and some benefit for infectious disease as well. So huge benefits. And also, again, if we follow this dietary pattern, we would have major benefits for limiting greenhouse gas emissions and reducing our trend toward path we're on, which is unsustainable climate change.
Do you subscribe to the assertion that a chronic disease like obesity, high blood pressure and diabetes can be reversed through acquiring a high-quality diet and a healthy lifestyle?
Some of this chronic disease may be reversible, but the most important thing is to prevent it in the first place. And even if we have some heart disease and we're still alive and kicking, preventing it from getting worse. And there can be huge impacts of a diet and lifestyle. For example, if you put good diets together with regular physical activity, not smoking, not overdoing alcohol, and not being overweight or obese, we could prevent over 90% of type 2 diabetes, over 80% of heart disease. So huge potential benefits.
What are your opinions on the existence of a whole gamut of different diets out there at the moment that seem to be proliferating because of the internet? Now, I know you're not a fan of the internet. I've heard you say that before. But I've had many experts and many people who promote various different diets, everything from vegan to keto right through to paleo and carnivore. I've had these people on this podcast at various points, and many of them speak glowingly about the benefits of each individual diet. I just want to get your thoughts on that variety of diets, first of all, and then the fact that the people promoting these diets then come from a medical or indeed a scientific background, as you do yourself.
As you say, there are strong proponents of a wide spectrum of different diets, ranging from extreme low fat to extreme high fat to whole meat to carnivore kind of diet. But by far the best evidence does come from studies looking at the Mediterranean type diet, which is more balanced. It's sort of moderate in fat and protein, sort of in the middle. And it has the building blocks for which we have a huge amount of good evidence of plenty of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and limiting animal sources of protein. Some of these other diets have just not been studied for long term, and part of it, these more extreme diets, it's very difficult for people to stay on those for the long run. In studies that have tried to look at them, even by 1 year, they've had massive dropouts. So that is an important aspect of diet. Nothing is going to work unless people can live with it for years. Some of these other diets have just not been studied for long term, and part of it, these more extreme diets, it's very difficult for people to stay on those for the long run. In studies that have tried to look at them, even by 1 year, they've had massive dropouts.
Okay, so looking at that whole range of diets that we've been talking about, the one unifying factor across all of them seems to be the need to jettison refined carbs. Regardless of the diet, they all seem to reject refined carbs. Would you agree with the fact that refined carbs are hugely problematic?
yes, refined carbs are a serious problem, in part because what's missing there in refining, we remove the majority of minerals, vitamins, and phytochemicals. And then on top of that, we create a form of carbohydrate that's very rapidly converted to blood glucose. And that puts a stress on our cells that secrete insulin, has other direct short-term metabolic effects, and we see related to diabetes, heart disease, and lots of other conditions. A little bit of bad news maybe for people in Ireland, but potatoes behave a lot like refined carbohydrates in many ways. And in some ways that worked when people were highly physically active and had lower insulin resistance, but now very few of us are that active. And we put on a little weight, that makes us more resistant to insulin, the benefits of insulin. And therefore, we respond poorly to high intakes of potatoes as well. It doesn't mean we have to eliminate them, but having if we're going to have a choice at dinner, most of the time it's better to have a whole grain.
Back in the 1970s, when you first started your research work, the advice at that time was different to what we hear about today. For example, consuming eggs, for instance, was frowned upon back in the 70s because they perceived a high cholesterol link. Can we talk about how that has changed, how the narrative has changed, how the science has changed over the last 50, 60 years, and how the very nature of science changing and progressing and finding new discoveries inadvertently contributes to the growth of confusion at the same time?
Back in the 1970s, when I got started, I realized people were being told, eat this and don't eat that. And when you scratched the surface to look at the evidence, there was almost no evidence to support what people were saying. And that's why we set up our long-term studies, where we've now enrolled almost 300,000 people who we've been following since about 1980. And we've learned a lot during that time. Other studies have started as well. So we have a lot more data than we did back in the 1970s. And a lot of what we were saying back in the 1970s turns out not to have been supported very well. People were being told to load up on lots of carbohydrates and even not paying attention to the form of the carbohydrate. That was probably a huge problem. People were being told to eat margarine instead of butter. It turned out the margarine was very high in trans fat, even worse than butter, although butter's definitely not the best form of fat. And as you say, people were told to limit eggs to about twice a week. And the evidence on eggs is actually a little bit complicated, and it gets to the whole issue of substitution or comparison, which is fundamentally important to nutrition. In general, the studies haven't shown that eggs are related to increased risk of heart disease, except maybe among people with type 2 diabetes or other type 1 diabetes. But that doesn't mean that eggs are the healthiest breakfast, because that's just if you compare eggs to everything else that people are eating for breakfast, which is usually a lot of junk. So myself, I want to go for the best breakfast, and that would usually not include eggs. It would be, well, what I had this morning: steel-cut oats, Irish goats, people call them, and some nuts, a bit of yogurt, some fruit, and all the evidence suggests that that will actually be better than relying on eggs on a regular basis. Doesn't mean that eggs have to be eliminated, but I actually think that old recommendations of about 2 per week is still probably good if you really want to go for the healthiest diet.
Can we introduce the at times controversial name of Ancel Keys, who's associated with the American Heart Association, and he carried out the famous 7-country study where he looked at saturated dietary fat. And I have spoken with some of his detractors on this very podcast, and some of them were citing the fact, the flaws in his research, and namely the fact that a lot of his work and research was carried out on men, excluding women completely. So could I ask you your thoughts on this? And then where do you stand then on saturated fat then in the diet and its relationship with cardiovascular diseases?
Well, an interesting topic. And I think we need to be a little forgiving because Keys was operating as a real pioneer without the tools that we have today. And the most important thing that Keys found when he documented carefully the rates of heart disease using standardized definitions, there was about an 8 or 10-fold difference in heart disease rates between Northern Europe, particularly Finland, and Crete, and also low rates in the other Mediterranean countries. So that alone was a really key finding. And other people showed when those populations came to live in the U.S., everybody got about the same rates of heart disease. So it said that, most importantly, that there was something very powerful, not genetic, that was underlying the high rates of heart disease in the United States and Northern Europe. And he had a very strong correlation between saturated fat and heart disease, but he also did realize that it was too strong. There had to be something else going on there. And initially that was used to say, well, we should get rid of all types of fat in the diet. But what he showed in more detailed analyses that actually the fat was just as high in Crete as it was in Northern Europe, but it was a different kind of fat. Basically, it was mostly olive oil and other unsaturated fats at that time. So what we've learned is, and Keith did in later life appreciate this and recognize that the type of fat is really more important than the total amount of fat in the diet. So I think that fundamentally Keith was probably mostly correct. He missed some big things. He missed that obesity is a major risk factor, and that's pretty big. But for an optimal diet, I think here, back to the comparison, saturated fat, if you compare it to refined starch and sugar, it's going to be about the same. But if you compare unsaturated fats like olive oil, soybean oil, canola oil to saturated fat, definitely it's better to have those unsaturated fats in the diet. So this idea that you could eat all the saturated fat you want to and it won't be harmful is really simply wrong. But the replacement is what's really important.
It's amazing because, as I said, I spoke recently with somebody who was a proponent of the ketogenic diet, and this individual's diet comprised 70 to 80% of dietary fat. So you're suggesting that that is not the way to go?
If you do want to have a ketogenic diet, I think it is possible to do that. But if you're going to do it, it would be better to have a plant-based ketogenic diet rather than some of these ketogenic diets. Most of them are emphasizing a lot of red meat and dairy, which is not going to be a healthy diet in the long run. I did, as we were talking about earlier, there's benefits of replacing all these unhealthy carbohydrates. And so a lot of people on the ketogenic diets will have health benefits in terms of weight control and improving other metabolic variables as well. But for the long term, first of all, we actually don't have long-term evidence on those kinds of diets in relation to heart disease, mainly because people don't stay on those diets for long term. And the proponents have tried to look at this. They reported major benefits on weight over 6 months, but by 12 months, there wasn't much difference, and a lot of that was just dropouts. The people couldn't stay on those extreme diets. But if somebody does want to go to a very low carbohydrate, high fat, or even ketogenic diet, there are ways to do it that are going to be much healthier. That could be a lot of non-starchy vegetables, for example, and a lot of nuts, a lot of healthy plant oils, some moderate amount of fish and poultry. You can basically sort of take a Mediterranean diet, chop out the grains or greatly reduce the grains, and you end up with a diet that would be very low carbohydrate.
We mentioned eggs already and that perceived association with high levels of bad cholesterol in the system and then giving rise to cardiac issues. Could you talk to me about what your opinion is in relation to dietarily optimizing your cholesterol levels, be it the HDL, LDL, triglycerides, etc.?
It is important, as you're implying, to look at all of these factors. And the total cholesterol really doesn't mean too much. It really is looking at LDL, which some people deny, but there's overwhelming evidence from all kinds of studies that LDL does increase the risk of heart disease. Some people have emphasized it's only the small, dense LDL, but it looks like all forms of LDL contribute. And at the same time, we need to keep an eye on our HDL and our triglycerides. There's a lot of confusion and uncertainty actually about the direct etiologic or direct causal relationship between HDL and low risk of heart disease, but it's definitely low HDL is definitely a high predictor of increased risk of heart disease. And a debate about whether it's the low HDL or high triglycerides, it goes back and forth. But still, that picture of low HDL and high triglycerides indicates metabolic syndrome disturbance. That is an indicator of our risk of diabetes and other adverse health outcomes. So again, whether it's the triglycerides or the HDL, they're inversely correlated. That's really the direct cause of these risks, we're not entirely sure. But we would like to have a diet that is both low in LDL cholesterol and relatively good or a little bit higher in triglycerides and a little bit higher in HDL and lower in triglycerides. That's the overall pattern.
And then what foods can we consume then that would encourage that ratio that you're talking about?
The foods that provide this healthy metabolic picture are in general going to be higher fat in the diet, but healthy fats, mostly unsaturated fats. So that's really the most important factor. And sort of on the flip side, keeping carbohydrates low to moderate and paying a lot of attention to the form of carbohydrates. So it does go back, that takes you back to the traditional Mediterranean diet.
You've been involved with multiple large observational studies over a period of years, as you mentioned, up to 300,000 people. And one of those observational studies is the very well-known Nurses' Health Study. And you co-authored the book, The Fertility Diet, which was based on your observations of these nurses. How best to get pregnant? Well, what were your findings here? How best can people get pregnant from a dietary standpoint?
Well, there's some things you do in addition to pay attention to your diet to get pregnant, but we all know about those. But there were a lot of interesting and I think important findings that came out of that. I was reading the first careful look at Jorge Chavarro, one of my doctoral students at that time. He's now a full professor, had this idea of looking at diet and fertility. And as we started to peel back the aspects of diet, a lot emerged. Very importantly, is underlying insulin resistance is related to infertility. And of course, obesity is the major driver of insulin resistance. And so we found that the maximum fertility was somewhere between a BMI of about 19 and 24, somewhere in that range, maybe around 22 being optimal. But even by the time people got a little bit overweight, there was started to be some increase in infertility there. And at the other end of the spectrum is polycystic ovary syndrome, which is fundamentally a disease of insulin resistance. And that's the extreme. We've known about that for a long time, but there's really a whole spectrum. That's the end of the spectrum. And even just, again, moderate overweight will increase the risk of infertility. Then we saw that the foods that contribute to or protect from insulin resistance were important as well. And so that trans fat, which is fortunately now out of our food system, was a risk factor for infertility and it's a known risk factor for type 2 diabetes as well. Healthy fats were better. Interestingly, it looked like low iron was a risk factor for infertility. So it does look like, perhaps not surprisingly, the diet that's healthy for other organs around our body is also important for fertility.
And would you know, does this apply to men and male fertility also?
Some of these findings do, and that wasn't in the book we covered, but Dr. Chavarro has gone on to look at male infertility, and in general, the same picture emerges.
I found a quote of yours online, if I can read it back to you. I'm presuming this is accurate because, as we've said before, not everything that you'll find online is true. But this quote says, if you step back and look at the data, the optimum amount of red meat you should eat should be 0. Now, I'm presuming that is the case. What do you say to those people who suggest that our ancestors would have eaten red meat when available because there was so much scarcity back then? And then obviously then today you have people who advocate for things like the carnivore diet.
That was specifically referring to the international correlations between red meat and diseases like colorectal cancer. And actually, that's interesting. I haven't thought about that quote for some while. But as we've got a lot more data, it does still look like that's about true. Again, it's critically important what we replace red meat with. If we replace it with a bunch of refined starch and sugar, that's not going to be good. Probably going to be worse than eating red meat, actually. But now we have a lot of data. We've just published an update on our analyses looking at red meat in relation to type 2 diabetes. And it's pretty much a straight line relationship that goes from 0 with even a little bit of red meat, increasing risk, and just straight on up from there. So the optimum does look like it would be 0, again, especially if it's replaced with healthy forms of protein, such as nuts, soy, and legumes. So when you have such a linear straight line relationship going through down to zero, where do you draw the line and say this is an acceptable amount of red meat? And in our Eat Lancet Commission, we looked at the data, and we saw with about one serving of red meat per week, it started to be some increase in risk. It was still pretty low, and that's why we said that a reasonable limit to red meat would be about one serving per week. So I think basically that's true. Now, if you go back, because you're saying to evolutionarily where people grew up, they probably didn't. In Africa, I very much doubt that they were eating red meat for most of their diet. That they were hunter and gatherers, and there was a lot of gathering going on there. If we look at primitive tribes, they're almost all vanished now, but they didn't eat just meat. Eating meat was a good survival technology in northern climates where you can't have fresh foods available for much or even most of the year. And so meat and dairy were a way to survive and reproduce in northern climates. But people didn't necessarily live to long, ripe old ages, which we would like to do now. We'd like to be healthy and active to 80 or 90 or 100. And from everything we see that, especially in our current context where we're not highly, highly active like people were much more so in the past, replacing red meat with healthy plant protein sources in general will be better. Again, what we're saying is that red meat doesn't need to be zero, but keep it quite low and emphasize the healthy plant protein sources.
You introduced the topic of dairy there. I'll take the opportunity to ask you about consuming milk and cheese. Now, milk is something I haven't drunk in many years simply because I don't like the taste. But what are the observations that you can make in relation to consumption of milk and dairy? Should we be doing this or should we not?
Milk and dairy is actually a really interesting scientific issue because it's so complicated. And then because there is a lot of nutritional value in milk and dairy. It was meant to provide young mammals with everything they needed to grow for the early parts of our lives. So it is complex. But as we've looked at dairy in relation to many health outcomes now, we don't see major benefits or major harms. It's sort of in the middle of the spectrum. So again, the issue is the comparison. And if we look at total mortality, there is a higher risk of death for dairy consumption compared to plant protein sources. If we look at dairy compared to processed or red meat, dairy looks a little bit better than that. So it's somewhere in the middle, and that's why I think the number, as I mentioned earlier, about one serving per day of dairy is actually a pretty good number because it means that it does provide a bit of a nutritional safety net. We're not going to get too low in calcium, which is the usual major justification for dairy, but we're not going to get too high. And the main adverse effects of high dairy have been prostate cancer. That's one outcome where there is an increased risk. On the other hand, there's some reduction in colorectal cancer. It seems pretty clear that reduction in risk is due to the calcium in dairy, and there's lots of other ways to get calcium, including just a simple calcium pill, and that's going to be a lot cheaper, no saturated fat, no calories, safer in every way. So again, dairy is complicated. The main justification has been fracture risk, and there have been many studies and a recent meta-analysis showing that dairy consumption during adult life is not related to lower risk of fractures. And very interestingly, when we look at dairy consumption during adolescence, we actually see increased risk of fractures related to dairy. And it seems a little counterintuitive, but probably the main mechanism is that milk does increase height. And again, that's not too surprising. The role of dairy is to make young mammals grow fast. And there's all the nutrients plus hormones that make us grow fast. But you don't necessarily want our growth accelerator to the fore for all of our life, like drinking a lot of milk would do if we continue to consume high dairy consumption. And we do see that, even before this analysis, we had seen that greater height is strongly related to more hip fractures and some other fractures later in life. So by consuming a lot of dairy during adolescence, we do grow a little bit taller, but that's not necessarily good. It is strongly related to higher risk of fractures later in life. And that probably, at least mostly, I think explains a paradox that we've known for decades. That's fracture risks are higher in the milk drinking countries, Sweden, northern European countries, compared to parts of the world that drink little milk or no milk at all. In fact, just looking at some data from Indonesia, where they have good data, it has the lowest recorded fracture rates in the world, and they have zero milk intake. And by adults, it's just not part of the culture at all. And their calcium intake is about 250 milligrams a day. So this idea that we need all this calcium is fundamentally wrong. It's based on studies that last only 2 or 3 weeks. Definitely, we need calcium. It's essential, but these super high levels that require drinking 3 servings of milk per day are just not necessary, and actually can be a problem. And the other big picture issue, if we have 3 servings of dairy a day, we're putting a massive amount of saturated fat into the food system. And that's what Ansel Keys was really seeing back in the studies that we were talking about earlier. That massive amount of dairy fat is not healthy. It will get you to reproduce and live to your 50 or 60, but that's not what we're looking for these days. We'd like to have a longer, healthier life, and a more Mediterranean pattern with healthier fats would be better.
I love my fruit. We've been told historically to consume 5 servings of fruit per day. Now, on the flip side, we know that fruit has fructose, and fructose can elevate the blood sugar levels. So what are your thoughts on fruit consumption, and what kinds of fruit should we be consuming, and how often?
There was 5 servings of fruits plus vegetables per day, I think, right? Yeah. So, yes, fruits in general, we see good. There's lots of micronutrients and phytochemicals that we don't completely understand and that come along with fruits and vegetables. But many fruits do contain a fair amount of fructose. But fructose is actually one molecule of glucose and one molecule. With fructose, we get in sugar, we get 1 molecule of fructose and 1 molecule of glucose. So we've looked at this in some recent studies, and we do see that higher fructose is not good for us, but actually higher glucose or glucose equivalence is a little bit worse for us than fructose. So there's been some people saying the whole problem is fructose. No, glucose and glucose equivalents. In other words, starch is quickly converted to glucose. So you have to look at the total equivalence, taking the starch plus the glucose, and that is actually worse than, if anything, a little bit worse than fructose. So, we're getting a lot of sugar, basically. The form of the sugar doesn't matter too much when we consume fruit. But if we consume whole fruit, we don't see a problem really with that. And that's because we don't get huge amounts if we have an orange or an apple. And the whole fruit, the sugar is encapsulated inside the cells, and it takes us a while to break those cells apart in our digestive process. And so we don't get a quick, big spike in blood glucose levels, which is what we're really concerned about. But if we have it as fruit juice, then we've broken up the cell structure, and if we have a glass of orange juice, say, that's usually about 3 oranges we're drinking, and we can gulp it right down. And so that starts to become a problem. On the other hand, we do actually see some health benefits of orange juice. So I think having about 1 small glass a day is probably reasonable and probably good, actually. But I was, some years ago, just drinking it like a basic beverage, 4 or 5 glasses of orange juice a day. That isn't good, we've learned. So I think that moderate consumption is good, is fine and okay. But drinking multiple glasses of fruit juice a day is not a good idea. And it's really only, so far, the only form of juice that we've seen to be beneficial is orange juice. Some of the less common juices, we just don't have enough data to study, but a lot of it is apple juice. That's almost just like pure sugar and not good for us.
There you go, permission from Professor Willett that you can have your one glass of orange juice per day. But ideally, whole fruit is better than juices. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me today. Professor Walter Willett, author of Eat, Drink and Be Healthy. It's great to have you on the podcast. Thank you.
Thanks for paying attention to all of this.
Well, thank you for tuning into this episode of the Happy Habit Podcast. As always, if you could do two things for me, it would be terrific. You can subscribe by clicking that subscribe button on whatever platform you're on. It's absolutely free. And if you have the time at all, you can share with other people who you think might enjoy tuning into these episodes too. Until next time, stay happy.